Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You've found yourself in the company of the Sleepy Sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow, who enjoys facts, fossils, and the long, quiet patience of archaeological dust. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist of ancient adornments. A scientist wannabe who is almost always correct, except for those few times when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, rather than fuss over it. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please, let me know, what is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently, in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode of the Sleepy Sloth, devoted to the oldest shell beads ever discovered. Quiet, tiny treasures from the beginning of human decoration. At Skull Cave in Israel. Around 100,000 years before the modern era. Someone, with no knowledge of jewelry stores or online shopping carts, took a small marine shell and carefully pierced a hole through it. The shell, found deep within limestone layers, belonged to a marine snail of the genus Nassarius. It was not large or glamorous. Its value was not in sparkle or weight, but in the idea that something could be worn. Not for need, but for meaning. The bead, with its gentle perforation, may have been strung on sinew or grass fiber. Perhaps rubbed against skin until smooth as time itself. Archaeologists discovered it amid layers of sediment, its surface still holding traces of red ochre, suggesting it may have once been tinted in soft earthly tones. The act of perforating a shell requires intent, perhaps even patience, an act so slow that even I, the sleepy sloth, find it comfortingly familiar. The holes were made by scraping or drilling with stone tools, and though simple, they represent one of humanity's earliest gestures toward self-decoration, or perhaps communication without words. Let us drift now, very slowly, across the ancient sands to Oued Jabana in Algeria, where, around 82,000 years ago, similar Nassarius shells were discovered. These, too, bore the marks of deliberate piercing, though some were smoothed further by wear, suggesting they had been used or handled over time. It is thought that the shells were gathered from coastal regions, even though the cave itself lay inland. That means early humans carried them, perhaps over days, or even seasons, treasures of the sea carried into the dry heart of the land. Each small, pale bead held both geography and memory within its spiral. The chemical analysis of the shells revealed patterns of exposure, sunlight, soil, and perhaps the touch of fingers now long turned to dust. No one knows if they were worn as necklaces, or sewn into clothing, or offered as tokens of identity. And yet, there they are, patiently existing beyond the reach of their makers, whispering the quiet persistence of ornamentation itself. But first, a slow little detour. To Blombos Cave in South Africa, where 75,000 years ago, Nassarius crucianus shells, delicate, speckled, and pale, were transformed into beads. Archaeologists uncovered them in a layer of salty ochre-stained sediment. Some still carried faint red residues, possibly from pigment used to color the wearer or the shell. These early humans were thoughtful artisans, choosing shells of uniform size, piercing them near the apex, and stringing them in consistent sequences. This reveals not just a sense of decoration, but of rhythm, and ancient understanding of pattern. The shells were from the sea, yet Blombos lies several dozen kilometers inland. This tells us something fascinatingly dull but deeply soothing, that early humans planned ahead. They collected, transported, and possibly even exchanged these shells, establishing one of the earliest forms of symbolic trade. Each bead, a patient syllable in a wordless story. And then, gently onward, to Tafaralt Cave in Morocco, where 70,000 years ago, sea snail shells, once living in the waves of the Mediterranean, were gathered, perforated, and cherished. Some had traces of black and red pigment, suggesting alternating colors, perhaps to create a visual pattern that meant something to its maker, or nothing at all. What we know is that their presence marks an evolution of symbolic thinking, where objects began to hold emotional or cultural meaning beyond function. The perforated beads show deliberate wear marks around the holes, soft curves from rubbing against skin or cloth. One can imagine their faint clinking in the firelight of a cave, each bead turning slowly with movement. It is thought these early adornments might have conveyed belonging, age, or alliance, quiet concepts that even the sleepy sloth finds pleasantly unhurried to consider. Finally, let us move with gentle, unremarkable grace to Qasr Aqil in Lebanon, around 60,000 years ago. Here, perforated shell beads were found near early human remains. Some scholars have noted that their distribution within burial layers suggests they may have been worn in life and carried into death. The shells, likely from the nearby Mediterranean, were selected for consistency in size and texture, implying an eye for uniformity. To drill through a shell of this kind requires knowing exactly where the structure is thinnest. Too much pressure, and it breaks; too little, and the whole remains incomplete. The makers learn through slow repetition, just as the waves wear away the shore, not for efficiency, but for understanding. These beads, found in sediment compressed over millennia, speak softly of the continuity of human curiosity. A desire to shape and signify. To make meaning through material. Softly now. Let us wander to the quiet plains of ancient India, around 50,000 years before the Common Era, where early humans, surrounded by dust, wind, and the slow hum of the earth, took fragments of ostrich eggshell and turned them into beads. These were not quick creations. Each fragment, pale and curved, had to be chipped gently from the egg, shaped, and smoothed with stone, until it was round enough to please the maker's quiet eye. A small hole was drilled through its center, not by metal or machinery, but by patience itself. Archaeologists later found hundreds of these beads scattered across Upper Paleolithic sites, their edges polished by wear and by time. The eggshells, likely from the large Struthiocamelus, were gathered after natural breakage, perhaps from nesting grounds long abandoned. Some show signs of heating, as if to harden their texture or alter their color slightly to a warmer hue. Their presence in burials and domestic layers alike suggests something gentle but profound, that these early humans were adorning themselves, marking identity or memory, or perhaps simply enjoying the quiet rhythm of making things round and symmetrical. To pierce a hole in an eggshell is to measure pressure against fragility, and to succeed is to understand balance. The smooth, chalky texture would have felt cool against skin, a whisper of lightness in a world of stone and dust. And so, the oldest ornaments of India tell us not of glory, but of care, each bead a reminder that gentleness, even then, was a form of knowledge. And let us drift, like a small current moving through time, toward the coasts of South Africa, some 48,000 years before the present, where the sea's edge glittered with shells that would soon travel far inland. These were marine shells, often of Nassarius species again, collected by people living along the shoreline, who seemed to know that beauty could travel farther than the tide itself. The inland discoveries, hundreds of kilometers from any coast, show that these beads were carried or traded, passed from hand to hand, valley to valley, perhaps as symbols of connection or promise. Imagine the long, unhurried journey of a single shell, its small spiral gleaming softly in the firelight as it changed owners, each leaving a trace of oil or dust upon its surface. Some beads are worn smooth from long use, others cracked slightly at their perforations, testifying to the patient friction of being handled for years. Their presence deep in cave layers, where no sea creature could ever crawl, reveals the human desire to exchange more than food or tools, but ideas and symbols. A marine shell, carried into the dry heart of the continent, was more than decoration, it was a memory of the ocean, preserved in form. And so these quiet travelers of calcium and salt became the first long-distance traders, carried by the steady rhythm of footsteps across ancient earth. But first, a slow little detour to the lush and humid landscapes of Sri Lanka, around 45,000 years ago, where the air was thick with warmth and the forest hummed softly with unseen life. Here, perforated shells have been found within ancient layers of habitation, small, intentional artifacts used in rituals whose meanings have slipped quietly through time. Some were marine shells, others freshwater species, gathered and shaped with deliberate care. Microscopic analysis reveals tool marks, fine scratches that spiral gently around each aperture, showing they were bored rather than broken. These were not mere ornaments. The context of their discovery, alongside ochre fragments and hearth remains, suggests symbolic or ritual use, objects imbued with meaning beyond the visible. Perhaps they were worn during ceremonies, their gentle clinking echoing softly in the damp air. The people who made them may have viewed the shells as vessels of protection or transformation, their spiral forms mimicking the cycles of life itself. Each tiny perforation, each polished curve, was an act of reverence for nature's geometry. Even now, when scientists hold them under the cool light of microscopes, they find the same quiet elegance, a craft performed without haste, guided by hands that moved with the same patience as the forest around them. Ever so slowly, our thoughts drift across the vast blue toward Australia, some 40,000 years before the present, when early settlers, newcomers upon this ancient continent, collected shells from coastal shallows and strung them together into necklaces. These were among the oldest adornments known on that land, their quiet continuity stretching into the deep past of Aboriginal heritage. The shells were small, often of marine gastropods, pierced through their natural weak points or delicately drilled by stone tools. Some had been rubbed with red ochre, a pigment that seeped into their porous surfaces and left a faint, warm tint still visible today. Their presence in burial sites tells a story of care. Perhaps the shells were offerings, or symbols of belonging, or simply cherished objects placed near loved ones. The act of stringing them was likely slow and meditative, threading fiber through fragile forms, one after another, forming a line that shimmered faintly in sunlight. The necklaces may have marked kinship, passage, or memory, but whatever their meaning, they whispered of continuity, humans marking life through objects that endured. Even now, they rest beneath layers of earth, unbothered by time, their quiet symmetry intact, like tiny moons frozen in sediment. And now, with a breath as soft as dust settling upon stone, we drift north to ancient Croatia, where around 38,000 years ago, members of the Gravettian culture laid their dead to rest with shell beads as grave goods. These burials, found in caves like those of Vindija and elsewhere, reveal a tender kind of symbolism, a belief that beauty and belonging extended beyond life itself. The beads, often made from small marine shells like dentalium or glycymeris, were carefully arranged upon the bodies or woven into garments that have long since vanished. Many show signs of having been worn before burial, edges smooth, holes enlarged by long use, their surfaces faintly glossy from skin contact. Some still carry traces of ochre, suggesting they once glowed faintly red beneath the flicker of firelight. The presence of such objects in graves, far from the sea, suggests that they carried emotional or spiritual meaning, tokens to accompany the departed into whatever lay beyond. To craft each bead required precision, and to bury it was to relinquish something precious. Even now, when archaeologists brush soil away from these tiny relics, the moment feels suspended, as if time itself were pausing to remember the quiet intentions of those long gone. Each bead, no louder than a heartbeat, yet it endures, patiently, as the softest echo of early human thought. Softly, we drift now into the cold expanses of the ancient Czech plains, around 35,000 years before our calendars began their long and rhythmic count. Here, in layers of loess and mammoth bone, archaeologists uncovered tiny beads made from ivory, the dense, creamy tusk material of the great Mammuthus primigenius. Each bead was carefully perforated, shaped not by speed but by the slow insistence of time and the quiet repetition of motion. They were small, often only a few millimeters wide, yet each one held the memory of a long process, splitting, carving, smoothing, and finally, the delicate piercing that transformed ivory into ornament. These beads were found alongside marine shells, far from any sea, suggesting trade or travel, proof that even then, people carried beauty with them across frozen landscapes. The mammoth ivory surface, when polished, would have caught the faint light of fire or dawn, glowing softly against skin or fur clothing. They were symbols, perhaps, or simple expressions of care, tokens linking the natural world of great beasts to the tender human wish for adornment. In this pairing of ivory and shell, one finds the quiet rhythm of exchange between earth and ocean, a silent conversation in mineral and calcium. Each bead, so fragile, yet so impossibly patient, resting through the millennia until uncovered again by equally patient hands. And so, let us wander ever so gently westward, into what is now France, some 33,000 years ago, where the people of the Chauvet cave culture traced animals on limestone walls and, above ground, carried perforated shells as subtle markers of status or belonging. These shells, often from marine species though the caves themselves were inland, had been pierced with purpose, sometimes worn smooth around their holes from long use. Their discovery near human remains and habitation zones suggests they served more than decorative functions, they communicated identity, perhaps age, alliance, or the slow and quiet pride of accomplishment. Within the damp hush of the cave world, these ornaments may have glimmered faintly against the soft flicker of torches, a human echo of the painted herds on the walls. Some shells bore faint traces of pigment, red ochre or charcoal, indicating they were colored, possibly to stand out against pale clothing or skin. One might imagine the slow, repetitive process of applying pigment, of threading fibers through each tiny aperture, creating a pattern both meaningful and ephemeral. Even in such ancient times, there was an understanding that appearance could carry unspoken messages. Quiet hierarchies expressed not with words, but with the gentle gleam of shells gathered from faraway waters. Ever so slowly now, our gaze drifts toward the icy plains of Russia, around 30,000 years before the present, where the burials at Sungur speak in the language of precision and patience. Here, 2 children and an elder were laid to rest with thousands of beads, many carved from ivory and others from perforated freshwater shells. Each bead, scarcely half a centimeter in diameter, was shaped by hand and smoothed to perfection, a process estimated to take roughly 1 hour per piece. The entire collection, thousands upon thousands, represents years of meticulous work, an effort so calm and deliberate it almost defies modern imagination. The shells themselves came from freshwater environments, suggesting local gathering, yet their uniformity implies a communal understanding of craft. They were arranged on garments, perhaps sewn into cloaks or tunics, forming patterns that would have shimmered faintly in the soft light of fire. Archaeologists believe these arrangements were symbolic, denoting status, reverence, or memory, though the meaning remains as elusive as a dream. What is certain is that the care invested in each bead mirrors the quiet devotion of those who prepared the graves, a gesture of love, expressed in repetition and texture. One cannot help but imagine the tranquil rhythm of creation, scrape, polish, pierce, repeat, until sound itself becomes silence. But first, a slow little detour to the Italian peninsula, around 28,000 years before our current age of noise and haste. In the limestone shelters and open-air sites of the Paleolithic, people left behind traces of bone and shell beads, scattered like patient whispers across the soil. The shells, collected from Mediterranean shores, were sometimes mixed with small tubular bones of birds, both pierced with simple stone tools and strung together into necklaces or bracelets. Their perforations were practical yet beautifully precise, the edges smooth as though the maker had spent quiet hours ensuring comfort for the skin that would one day wear them. Some of these beads were discovered in habitation layers, others in burials, and their association with pigment suggests ritual or symbolism. The act of combining bone and shell, a creature of the land with one from the sea, may have carried meaning about connection between realms, or simply a fondness for balance and pattern. Each tiny piece, when viewed under magnification today, still bears the soft polish of use, the faint trace of having once touched warmth and motion. In these objects, one senses the ancient patience of those who knew beauty not as display, but as devotion. And slowly now, as though following the faint echo of footfalls through deep time, we find ourselves in the Iberian Peninsula, around 26,000 years before the present, during the era of the Magdalenian culture. Across caves, shelters, and plains, perforated shell beads appear in astonishing numbers, worn, traded, and treasured. They were made primarily from marine mollusks, species like Nassarius and Dentalium, collected from beaches and shaped with careful consistency. Their surfaces reveal polish from handling, and their distribution suggests that the making and wearing of beads had become a widespread practice, uniting distant groups through shared aesthetic and ritual traditions. Some were arranged in patterns that may have marked social ties, others buried with their owners, carrying the quiet weight of personal identity into the earth. Archaeologists have noted that even in sites hundreds of kilometers from the sea, these shells appear regularly, proof of trade networks that spread not goods, but gestures of shared humanity. Each bead, in its slow perfection, stands as a patient witness to cooperation and continuity. To hold one is to hold time itself, curved, smooth, and waiting. And let us drift one more gentle step through the corridors of prehistory, into what is now Germany, around 24,000 years before our age of clocks and screens. Here, small ivory figurines known as Venus sculptures were often found near perforated shell beads, objects of quiet mystery, created in a world ruled by cold and patience. The figurines, carved from mammoth ivory, depict forms of fertility and life, while the shell beads that accompanied them may have been worn or offered as ornamentation to the sacred. Their coexistence in archaeological layers hints at ritual pairing, art and adornment intertwined in meaning. The shells, likely sourced from the Danube or nearby ancient shorelines, had been pierced, polished, and sometimes stained with ochre. Their smooth forms, when found near the rounded contours of the Venus figures, speak of a shared tenderness, a reverence for creation, for continuity, for the enduring shapes of existence. Each bead might have rested gently upon the carved figure, or upon the body of its maker, linking the living to the symbolic. And as centuries turned to millennia, the two, ivory and shell, remained side by side beneath layers of sediment, their quiet dialogue unbroken. The world around them shifted, glaciers retreated, forests grew, but the small, patient beads continued to exist, holding in their silence the memory of hands that once shaped beauty from stillness. Softly, we drift toward the cool plains of ancient Poland, around 22,000 years before the current calendar began its patient ticking. Here, among frozen soils and river valleys once visited by mammoths and reindeer, archaeologists have found burials adorned with small treasures, perforated shells and tiny amber beads. Each bead, though silent, speaks of an intimacy between humans and their materials. The shells were likely gathered from the Baltic coastline, their once lustrous surfaces dulled by age but still bearing the smooth, sea-worn texture that comes only from tides and time. The amber, fossilized resin of ancient conifer forests, would have glowed a soft honey color when warmed by the skin, as if holding the faint memory of sunlight long past. Together they formed necklaces, bracelets, or adornments sewn into garments, tokens not of wealth, but of belonging, identity, or remembrance. Microscopic study reveals polish from repeated handling, suggesting they were cherished in life before accompanying their owners into the stillness of burial. The quiet act of threading these beads, of arranging color and texture in gentle sequence, shows a kind of artistry grounded not in extravagance but in patience. The combination of seashell and amber, ocean and forest, water and sap, tells a story of connection between distant places, gathered and strung by hands that understood the soft power of small, enduring beauty. And then, with a slow exhale of thought, we drift toward ancient Portugal, some 20,000 years before our present counting. Deep inland, far from the salted air of the Atlantic, archaeologists unearthed marine shell beads, objects that could only have come from the sea. Their presence here, in valleys and cave shelters far removed from any shore, reveals the quiet hum of prehistoric trade or exchange. These shells, likely of Mediterranean and Atlantic species such as Nassarius or Dentalium, bear the same deliberate perforations seen across Ice Age Europe. Some still carry traces of red ochre, perhaps once rubbed onto the skin of their wearers or used to stain fibers that threaded through their tiny openings. The inland discovery of these shells hints at a network of contact that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, long journeys through changing landscapes, each exchange carrying not only materials but stories. One can imagine the slow rhythm of movement, the meeting of travelers who bartered a shell for a flint blade, or perhaps for nothing more than a gesture of friendship. These beads, so small and unassuming, become symbols of continuity, of the human tendency to share, to give, to carry beauty even where it need not go. In the still air of Portuguese rock shelters, they waited, patient as time itself, until uncovered once more by curious hands in our own era. Ever so gently, our attention turns toward North Africa, specifically Morocco, some 18,000 years before today, where beads made from perforated shells dominated adornment and personal expression. Here, along the ancient coasts and interior caves, early humans gathered shells from species like Nassarius gibbaceus, drilling tiny holes through their apex and stringing them together. These were not rare materials, but the care with which they were selected suggests intent, pattern, and a quiet aesthetic sensibility. Many were found coated with iron oxide pigments, reds, browns, and ochres, that deepened their tone and perhaps carried symbolic or social meaning. The Maghreb's archaeological layers reveal these beads in great numbers, sometimes clustered as if they had once been necklaces or bracelets. It seems that the art of adornment had become a common thread in daily life, objects not only of beauty but of communication, marking belonging, maturity, or identity within a group. The sea's bounty, transformed by human patience into decoration, suggests a culture of stillness and care, where even the smallest fragment of shell was given purpose. One might imagine someone seated near a hearth, fingers gently sorting through shells, choosing one for its color, another for its symmetry, until a string of quiet symbols took shape, each bead a soft syllable in a wordless human language that spoke only of presence. Let us linger now, as though tracing faint footprints along a riverbank, in what is now France, around 16,000 years before the present. Here, during the Magdalenian period, ornaments of perforated marine shells were common, adorning garments, hair, and skin. The Magdalenian people, known for their intricate cave art and refined tools, also displayed a remarkable devotion to the delicate. Shell beads, sometimes marine, sometimes freshwater, were gathered even far from the sea, indicating that their value lay not in rarity, but in meaning. Some were arranged in alternating sequences, showing a love of rhythm and order. Others had been reshaped slightly, the edges smoothed to prevent irritation against clothing or skin, demonstrating a soft attention to detail. The shell's origins, many from Atlantic coasts or ancient river deltas, suggest that groups exchanged these ornaments as tokens of friendship, or as markers of shared belief. To think of them is to imagine quiet hands, threading fiber through tiny holes by firelight, perhaps humming softly as they worked. Each shell, curved like the crescent of a sleeping moon, was transformed into a piece of wearable time. Even now, when archaeologists uncover them, the faint shine still remains, a whisper of the sea preserved in the silence of stone. And now, drifting ever so slowly southward, we arrive at the Iberian caves of what is now Spain, around 15,000 years before our own restless age. In these cave burials, archaeologists have found necklaces composed of perforated shells, laid gently across the bodies of the deceased. The shells, often of marine species, were polished smooth by water and by touch. Their holes, clean and symmetrical, suggest patient craftsmanship, perhaps achieved with a flint burin or fine bone awl. Some necklaces still retained traces of ochre pigment, deep rust red against pale calcium, a color that would have glowed softly in torchlight. The arrangement of the beads in the graves implies symbolic placement, across the neck or chest, as though to preserve identity or comfort beyond life. This quiet gesture, the threading of shells to accompany the departed, speaks of tenderness, of memory, and of a belief that beauty had a place even in death. The soft clicking of shells against one another, their rhythmic sound as they moved, might once have echoed faintly through the darkness of the cave. Now, they rest again in stillness, as if the earth itself wished to cradle them, to keep their silence intact. With a breath as slow as wind through pine needles, we move onward into the wide expanse of what would one day be Russia, around 14,000 years before the present. Here, perforated shells have been found far from any ocean, suggesting that they were traded over great distances, carried perhaps along ancient river routes into the heart of Siberia. The shells, often from small marine mollusks, retain traces of transport wear, their surfaces abraded as if from long journeys inside leather pouches or sewn garments. They appear in burial and domestic contexts alike, showing that the exchange of ornament was as much social as symbolic. Some may have come from the Black Sea, others from the Arctic coast, each one a tiny record of human movement across frozen landscapes. To imagine their path is to imagine slowness itself, a shell, once borne by the sea, lifted by hand, carried for hundreds of kilometers, traded for a tool, then worn around a neck, then buried beneath snow and earth. Across time, it whispers of continuity, a faint echo of connection between waters and steppes, between hands that never met yet shared the same quiet desire to make the world a little more beautiful. But first, a slow little detour into the stony heart of what we now call Turkey, around 13,000 years before today, during the Epipaleolithic. Here, at sites such as Okuzini and Karain, archaeologists have uncovered shell beads not from burials, but from domestic spaces, hints that beauty had entered the daily rhythm of life. These shells, often from Mediterranean species, were perforated, polished, and worn, perhaps as personal ornaments or sewn into clothing. Some bear residues of red pigment, and their placement near hearths and sleeping areas suggests they were handled frequently, maybe treasured like small charms. In this period, people were shifting from nomadic hunting to more settled living, an era of slow transformation. The beads, in their patient simplicity, mirror that transition, still carrying the wanderer's love of the portable, yet already part of home. When held to the light, their translucent surfaces catch warmth like droplets of time, each one a preserved sigh of sea air, a reminder of continuity in a changing world. And with one last slow breath of curiosity, we arrive in the Levant, around 12,000 years before our time, among the Nachfian culture, a people poised delicately between foraging and farming, between wandering and staying. Here, in caves and open-air sites across the Jordan Valley and beyond, archaeologists have found elaborate necklaces of shell beads, hundreds of them, strung with astonishing precision. Some were made from dentalium shells, others from Nassarius and Columbella, all gathered from Mediterranean and Red Sea shores. Their distribution shows wide trade networks, their polish reveals long use. Some were found in graves, others in domestic areas, as though life and death shared the same quiet ornaments. The Nachians arranged their beads in patterns, alternating colors, sizes, or species, showing an early sense of design that feels almost modern in its calm intention. To string such a necklace was to practice stillness, to repeat motion until it became meditation. These necklaces, fragile yet enduring, whisper of humanity's first settled dreams, of belonging, of expression, of a desire to make permanence from the impermanent. Each shell, once shaped by waves, became part of a human story, and together, they formed a gentle chorus that has not quite stopped singing, even across 12,000 silent years. There is something profoundly gentle about the burials along the Nile Valley around 12,000 years before our time, in what is now Sudan. The early people who lived near those quiet, meandering waters often left behind small, tender traces of their presence, among them, delicate shell beads, lovingly perforated and strung together into necklaces or bracelets. These ornaments, discovered in early burials, were made from tiny riverine shells polished to a soft sheen. Each hole drilled carefully, perhaps with stone tools or even fine bone awls, until a thread, maybe made of plant fiber or sinew, could pass through. One imagines the slow patience this required, the soundless rhythm of repetitive motion, the quiet focus of hands moving under the warmth of ancient light. The shells themselves had traveled, collected from the riverbanks or carried from distant shores, suggesting a kind of early admiration for beauty, for texture, and perhaps for the meaning that objects could hold. Some scholars think these beads marked identity, others that they symbolized belonging, affection, or memory. But whatever their purpose, they remind us that even in prehistory, the impulse to decorate the body, to make something as temporary as flesh shimmer, was already there. And as we drift with this thought, let us float gently onward, toward the next whisper of time. There, around 11,500 years before our time, in what is now North America, traces of the Clovis people appear, a culture known primarily for their finely fluted spear points, yet, quietly, they also left behind perforated marine shells. These shells were often found far from the coast, carried inland by travelers who must have valued them enough to bring them across plains and rivers. The perforations, small, circular openings, allowed them to be strung into necklaces or sewn onto clothing. One might imagine their pale, worn surfaces catching flickers of firelight at night. The Clovis world was wide and changing, with megafauna roaming and glaciers receding, yet even amid that grandeur, someone took the time to sit, to drill a tiny hole, and to create something purely decorative. But first, a small detour. For this extra gentle thought, shells, being calcium carbonate, carry within them the story of vanished oceans. Each bead, in essence, is a fossil echo of quiet waters long gone. To wear such a thing was perhaps to wear a memory of another place, another time. And so these early ornaments, though simple, shimmer with a slow kind of connection, a reminder that the desire to hold beauty close has always been with us. As we drift softly into the warmth of 10,500 years before our time, we find ourselves in what is now Peru, where preceramic cultures, long before pottery or metal, were already threading together perforated beads. Here, cotton was cultivated early, and along with fibers came the art of stringing, twisting, and weaving. The beads, small and patient, were often made from shells gathered along the Pacific coast. Each was drilled carefully, likely using a pointed tool of stone, in a process that could take long, repetitive hours. The act itself might have been meditative, a quiet dialogue between hand, tool, and material. These perforated shells were sometimes found near early dwellings or burial contexts, suggesting that they had both personal and ritual significance. The people who wore them may not have considered themselves artists, and yet, through these objects, they told the world that they noticed beauty. The colors, perhaps white or faintly rose-tinted, would have stood out softly against sun-browned skin. And as cotton threads intertwined with shell, a new form of adornment, one both natural and crafted, took shape along the Peruvian coast. You may not care. And that is completely fine. But somewhere, a shell once held by the sea became a human ornament, and that is quietly lovely. A little later, around 10,000 years before our time, in the archipelagos of Japan, the Jomon people were also adorning themselves with shell beads. The Jomon, whose name means cord-marked, for their pottery's patterns, lived in close dialogue with the sea. They collected shells not only for food but also for art, transforming them into small, rounded beads that glimmered softly in the coastal light. Archaeologists have uncovered these from shell mounds, ancient refuse heaps that, like accidental time capsules, preserved glimpses of daily life. Each bead carried the trace of the ocean, and the methodical perforation reflected a level of technical skill unusual for its age. But perhaps the more poetic detail is how these beads may have sounded, faintly clicking together when worn, producing a whispering rhythm against skin. That sound, repeated over centuries, becomes almost like the heartbeat of prehistory, slow, soft, unhurried. And as we breathe with that rhythm, we drift onward, to the southern reaches of the world. Around 9,500 years before our time, far away in Chile's Monte Verde site, early humans left behind what might be the earliest known beads in South America. These were also made from shells, but of a different kind, freshwater shells collected from nearby streams and perforated by hand. The beads are small, modest things, yet their existence hints at a mind already aware of beauty's quiet power. Monte Verde was a place of survival, wooden structures, simple tools, and traces of plant gathering, yet even there, amid necessity, someone paused to make an ornament. The patience of this act feels deeply human, to take something fragile, drill through it without breaking it, and thread it into meaning. The shell's surfaces, smooth from river currents, would have carried a tactile pleasure, cool, rounded, faintly glistening. When worn, they might have swayed gently with each movement, catching the dim light of a fire. These small details, weight, sound, and feel, are what turn objects into stories. And so, with the slowest of steps, we find ourselves around 9,000 years before our time, in what is now Sweden. Here, Mesolithic burials have been discovered where the deceased were adorned with perforated shells, perhaps of local mollusks, or traded from coasts farther away. The shells were often arranged in patterns, suggesting deliberate design, perhaps symbolic of rank or remembrance. In some graves, hundreds of tiny beads were found, strung tightly around the head or chest, forming quiet halos of ornamentation. To make these would have required immense patience, selecting shells of matching size, drilling holes through delicate surfaces, and threading them with fibers that would one day decay. But the idea survived, that of honoring life with detail, of decorating even the passage into death with care. These ancient Swedish burials remind us that art does not begin with civilization, it begins with attention, with the slow noticing of beauty where none is required. Let us drift now, softly, toward the lands of Israel around 8,500 years before our time, where early Neolithic communities were beginning to settle, to farm, to form something like home. Among their modest possessions, archaeologists have uncovered ornaments made from shell beads, small tokens of individuality in an increasingly communal world. The shells often came from the Mediterranean coast, carried inland, sometimes hundreds of kilometers. The effort to transport such fragile things suggests they mattered deeply, not for survival, but for meaning. Each bead had been shaped, polished, and pierced with deliberate care. Some were worn on the body, others sewn into clothing or headgear. These early Neolithic people, perhaps without knowing it, had created one of the world's first industries of adornment, where trade, craft, and expression intertwined. But first, a slow little detour. To consider how the human hand learns patience. In every drilled bead lies a rhythm, a repetition, a calm defiance against haste. It is the same rhythm that still hums in the crafts of today. And lastly, for this gentle stretch of time, let us float to around 8,000 years before our time, in what is now Mexico's Cueva de Coxcolan. Here, in the soft layers of early habitation, archaeologists have found perforated shells once worn or treasured by ancient inhabitants. The shells likely came from far-off coasts, carried into the dry highlands through early trade or migration. They were polished smooth, their perforations neat and intentional. Some might have been used in rituals, others as ornaments, and perhaps some simply as tokens of memory. The people who lived in these caves were among the first to cultivate plants that would later transform human history, yet, Amid all that slow domestication of the earth, they still found beauty in the ocean's cast-offs. To hold a shell bead in one's hand then, as now, is to touch both sea and stone, both distance and intimacy. And so, the thread continues. Quiet, unbroken. Looping softly through the long story of humankind. There is a particular softness in the archaeological whispers of Franche Cave, in what we now call Greece, around 7,800 years before our time. Here, along the gentle curves of a quiet bay, early people collected marine shells and transformed them into tiny, perforated beads. One can imagine the care required, selecting shells of similar size, polishing them to a subtle sheen, and then piercing each one with painstaking precision, likely using a pointed tool of stone or bone. The perforations were small, precise, allowing threads of plant fiber or sinew to pass through, forming necklaces, bracelets, or perhaps ornaments we will never fully understand. These beads, discovered in layers of habitation, suggest that beauty, even subtle, portable beauty, was a companion to survival. The shells themselves traveled, perhaps carried from distant shores or gathered from local waters, and in that movement we sense a quiet admiration for both the natural world and the delicate craft of hands that notice small things. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, marine shells, being composed of calcium carbonate, hold within them a story of ancient oceans, waves, and currents that shaped them long before human eyes noticed their elegance. And so, these small objects, though simple, carry a soft memory of water, wind, and human attention, drifting through time like a feather on a slow breeze. Around 7,600 years before our time, in the northern reaches of Denmark, the Erdebol culture similarly adorned themselves with perforated shells, often as amulets. These were not mere decorations, they may have carried significance in protective rituals, worn close to the body, perhaps dangling softly against fur or hide. Archaeologists have discovered these beads in both dwelling layers and burial contexts, suggesting they marked identity, status, or memory. Each bead required deliberate patience, with perforation achieved through careful scraping or drilling. One might imagine the slow rhythm of hands, the quiet focus, the tactile engagement with smooth, cool surfaces, over days or weeks. The shells themselves, faintly worn by tides or river currents, would have provided a gentle, natural texture, and the soft sound of their movement when strung together may have been a subtle accompaniment to everyday life. And as we drift with this observation, we notice that such objects were more than adornment, they were early gestures toward connection, memory, and beauty. Far to the east, around 7,400 years before our time, the Pengtosan culture in what is now China similarly incorporated perforated shells into burials. These beads, carefully arranged, show an enduring human impulse to transform natural materials into ornaments that honor the body and perhaps the passage beyond life. Each shell may have been selected for its shape, color, and smoothness, polished with patience, and pierced to allow threading along fine fibers. It is likely that some beads were worn daily, while others were reserved for special occasions or funerary rites. One can almost hear the quiet tapping of the tool against shell, the repetitive rhythm of making, and sense the meditative attention that went into each small, circular perforation. But first, a slow little detour. To consider the time it would take, hours, perhaps days, of calm focus, resulting in objects that might have survived the centuries only to whisper their story to us now. In these tiny, deliberate artifacts, we glimpse a quiet continuity of care, an early human reverence for texture, rhythm, and the subtle beauty of the natural world. In the northern lands of Finland, around 7,200 years before our time, Mesolithic burials similarly contained shell bead decorations. These small, perforated ornaments were included among grave goods, perhaps marking identity, status, or memory, or simply providing a soft adornment to accompany the journey beyond life. The beads were likely sourced from coastal waters or inland rivers, and their perforation required both dexterity and patience, using tools that allowed for careful drilling without fracturing the delicate shell. Each bead, strung upon plant fibers or sinew, formed gentle patterns, some linear, others more complex, adorning the body in ways we can only imagine. One can picture the quiet diligence of hands, the repetitive rhythm of creating, and the soft satisfaction of completing a tiny work of art. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each bead carries the echo of the waters it came from, as well as the memory of the hand that held it, bridging time and space in a whispering, almost imperceptible connection. And so, in these Mesolithic graves, we witness how ornamentation is both deeply human and profoundly quiet, a soft, enduring dialogue between people and their environment. In Egypt, around 7,000 years before our time, the Fayum culture also embraced the delicate art of perforated marine shell ornaments. These beads were often worn around the neck or attached to clothing, and their presence in burial sites suggests a symbolic or ceremonial significance, perhaps intended to honor the deceased or maintain connections with the living. Each bead required careful selection and drilling, with polished surfaces catching light in subtle ways. The shells were likely transported from lakes or the Mediterranean, hinting at early trade networks and a desire to gather beautiful or meaningful objects from afar. One might imagine the patient hands at work, the quiet rhythm of perforating and stringing, and the satisfaction found in a simple, tactile creation. But first, a slow little detour. To notice that each bead is a story of journey, both of the shell itself and of the human attention devoted to it, forming a soft, unbroken thread that connects past to present. Around 6,800 years before our time, in the region of present-day India, the early burials at Meghar reveal the careful use of shell beads. These perforated ornaments were sometimes worn in clusters, strung along fibers, and included among grave goods, suggesting a subtle expression of identity, memory, or protection. The shells, polished and delicately drilled, required patience and skill, and they carried with them the quiet presence of the distant waters from which they were collected. One might picture the slow passage of time, the meditative focus of fingers shaping each bead, and the rhythmic repetition that transforms natural material into something both decorative and meaningful. In Meghar, as elsewhere, these small objects act as soft whispers from the past, connecting human hands, water, and earth in a gentle, enduring narrative. In Western Europe, roughly 6,600 years before our time, the linear pottery culture in France continued the tradition of using perforated shell beads. Found in domestic and funerary contexts, these beads were strung with care, likely upon fibers of flax or other early textiles. Each perforation required deliberate attention, a quiet interaction between tool, shell, and maker, producing small, polished objects that could be worn close to the body. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle observation, the continued presence of shell beads over generations suggests that humans, even in the midst of daily labor and subsistence, were attuned to beauty, rhythm, and the tactile satisfaction of creation. These humble ornaments quietly remind us that adornment is as old as human attention itself. And, around 6,400 years before our time, on the island of Cyprus, the villagers of Karakisha similarly employed marine shell bead ornaments. Small, perforated shells were strung and worn, perhaps for decoration, ritual, or identity, and carefully preserved within domestic and burial contexts. One can almost feel the patience required to drill each hole, smooth each surface, and string them into gentle patterns. The shells may have traveled across water or been collected locally, yet each carries the imprint of hands and intention, echoing across the centuries. And so, we float gently with this thought. Through the quiet labor of early human attention, woven softly into tiny, enduring traces of beauty. Around 6,200 years before our time, in the rolling hills and fertile valleys of the Balkans, early Neolithic communities were quietly crafting and using perforated shells in ritual contexts. One can almost imagine the soft light of dawn filtering over fields of wild cereals, while hands, careful and patient, selected tiny shells for their smoothness, color, and subtle natural patterning. Each shell was perforated slowly, likely with a pointed stone or bone implement, until a fine fiber or sinew could be threaded through. These were not merely ornaments, they were objects of quiet significance, perhaps used in ceremonies, offerings, or as markers of status and belonging within the community. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, shells themselves carry the memory of ancient waters, their calcium carbonate whispering a faint echo of tides and currents long before human hands ever touched them. As these shells were strung together or held close, they may have connected the wearer with both the earth beneath their feet and the distant seas, a delicate reminder of the wider world. The labor involved, selecting, polishing, and perforating, was repetitive and meditative, a dialogue between material and maker that unfolded in quiet rhythm. It is tempting to imagine the faint click and shimmer of these beads as they moved together, each tiny ornament a soft testament to human patience and aesthetic awareness. And so, in these humble artifacts, we sense the early intertwining of beauty, ritual, and memory. Moving gently onward, roughly 6,000 years before our time, the Ubad culture in Mesopotamia embraced a similar fascination with shell beads, incorporating them into jewelry that adorned the body or perhaps served as amulets of protection. Excavations in Ubad settlements reveal carefully perforated shells, strung on fibers or cords, sometimes alongside small clay or stone beads. One might picture the quiet diligence required to create these pieces, drilling each tiny opening without cracking the fragile material, smoothing surfaces until they caught light softly, and threading them with a careful hand. These beads were carried across the community, perhaps traded between settlements or exchanged as tokens of affection, status, or spiritual significance. But first, a slow little detour. To appreciate that even such small objects are echoes of complex lives, carrying traces of travel, trade, and intention. The shells, often gathered from rivers or coasts, bring with them not only beauty but also stories of distance and connection. To hold or wear one of these beads would have been to carry a fragment of the wider world, a tactile link between human care and natural wonder, between daily life and ceremonial presence. In these early adornments, we glimpse a quietly persistent human desire to find significance, to honor connection, and to create beauty that endures. Around 5,800 years before our time, in the damp woodlands of what is now England, Starkar reveals Mesolithic sites rich with perforated shell adornments. Here, small beads were meticulously drilled and strung, likely worn as necklaces or sewn onto garments. The process of making each bead required careful attention, polishing the surface, selecting shells of harmonious size, and creating perforations precise enough to avoid fracture. One can imagine the gentle rhythm of fingers at work, the repetitive and meditative nature of the task, and the quiet satisfaction when a finished bead caught the faintest glimmer of light. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, shells are repositories of time, their curved surfaces shaped by currents and sand long before humans ever noticed them. By transforming these natural objects into personal adornments, the inhabitants of Starkar created a bridge between the living moment and the deep memory of water and earth. The worn surfaces of these beads may have whispered softly against the skin or tinkled faintly when they moved, adding an intimate soundtrack to the wearer's daily life. Each bead is both simple and profound, a tiny testament to the early human impulse to combine function, beauty, and connection in a single, delicate object. Drifting eastward to roughly 5,600 years before our time, the Kukutani culture in what is now Poland continued the gentle tradition of adorning the body with shell bead ornaments. These beads appear in domestic settings as well as graves, suggesting both everyday use and ritual significance. The shells were selected for their natural qualities, polished until smooth, and carefully perforated to allow threading along fibers that were likely plant-based or sinew. But first, A slow little detour. To note how quietly laborious this process was, each perforation demanded steady hands, patience, and repeated effort, and yet the result is both functional and beautiful. One might imagine the faint shimmer of these beads against sun-warmed skin, the subtle sound of their movement as they brushed together, and the sense of connection they offered, between wearer and maker, between individual and community, and between the natural world and human craft. In Kukutani society, these tiny beads hint at a deeper human inclination toward pattern, ritual, and aesthetic care, revealing that even amid daily survival, attention to detail and beauty held an enduring place in life. Around 5,400 years before our time, the houses of Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey contain traces of shell bead amulets, found within domestic spaces as well as near burials. These small, perforated shells were strung along fibers or sewn into clothing, likely serving protective or symbolic purposes, or simply as quiet adornments. Each bead represents careful selection, polishing, and piercing, undertaken with meditative attention. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, to pierce a shell without breaking it requires both skill and a certain rhythm, a measured dance between tool and material, between effort and patience. These tiny objects, preserved within the layers of homes, provide intimate insight into daily life and the gentle aesthetics of early human settlements. They speak to a soft but persistent urge to notice, to create, and to adorn, revealing that even small objects can carry rich layers of human experience. Far to the east, roughly 5,200 years before our time, the Yangshao culture in China produced shell bead ornaments that were worn or displayed within households. These perforated beads were carefully drilled, strung, and often included among domestic or ritual objects. The labor involved in their creation required patience and fine motor skill, turning simple shells into portable beauty. But first, a slow little detour. To notice how each bead represents a meditation on time, touch, and observation, the hands shaping it must have moved with quiet repetition, creating both a functional and aesthetic object. Each bead carries the imprint of the maker, as well as a whisper of the waters from which it originated. As we drift with these thoughts, we sense the enduring connection between natural material and human intention, a subtle and lasting reflection of care. And finally, around 5,000 years before our time, along the shores of the Persian Gulf, early Arabian Neolithic burials reveal perforated beads included as personal ornaments or ritual objects. These shells were smoothed, drilled, and strung, sometimes alongside other small materials, in patterns that suggest both beauty and meaning. One can picture the hands at work, the repeated motion of perforating and threading, and the quiet satisfaction found in these tiny creations. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each bead carries a faint echo of distant seas, a soft memory of water and movement, and a tender connection to the people who chose to carry and wear it. In these small, patient objects, we see once again the enduring human impulse to adorn, to remember, and to create beauty in miniature, quietly bridging the past with the present. Around 4,800 years before our time, on the sun-dappled shores of what is now Crete, early Minoan communities began to adopt small, delicately perforated shells as part of their intricate networks of trade and adornment. These shells, selected for their smooth surfaces and gentle colors, were transformed into beads that could be strung along fibers or cords, perhaps worn as necklaces or used as markers of connection and status within the community. One can almost see the soft rhythm of hands at work, fingers carefully drilling tiny perforations with pointed tools, perhaps bone or stone, while the maker pauses to inspect the gentle curvature of each shell. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, shells, being fragments of the sea, carry with them an echo of distant waves, a memory of water and tide that predates the human hand. As these beads traveled inland through trade, they may have brought with them a subtle whisper of the Aegean Sea, carrying both beauty and a sense of the wider world into domestic spaces. The labor involved in shaping and stringing these shells was repetitive, meditative, and quietly intimate, a slow dialogue between maker, material, and the hands that held it. These beads were not merely decoration, they were miniature vessels of meaning, a way to carry beauty, memory, and connection. The Minoans' use of such shells hints at an early sophistication, an appreciation for both aesthetics and the stories that objects can silently tell. Moving softly onward, roughly 4,600 years before our time, in the high valleys of what is now Colombia, early Andean burials reveal small shell bead ornaments, delicately perforated and placed with care among the deceased. The shells were likely sourced from coastal regions, carried inland over rivers and ridges, their soft, polished surfaces glinting faintly against the soil of graves. One imagines hands gently threading these beads, arranging them in subtle patterns that spoke to remembrance, status, or perhaps personal expression. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, each shell, once part of a living sea, now finds a quiet afterlife in the palms of humans long gone, carrying with it a trace of oceanic memory. These ornaments, modest in scale yet profound in presence, remind us that the impulse to create, to honor, and to adorn is not bound by environment, it flows quietly across continents and cultures. The repetitive motion of drilling, polishing, and threading could have been meditative, a subtle ritual of connection between maker, wearer, and the world of nature. To wear or place such a bead was to hold a whisper of the sea, a touch of faraway waters, near one's heart. Around 4,400 years before our time, in the serene lake-dwelling settlements of what is now Switzerland, early communities produced perforated shell beads that adorned bodies and homes alike. The beads, small and patient, required steady hands to craft, perforating each one without fracturing the delicate surface, polishing to reveal subtle lusters, and threading them into strings that may have decorated clothing, hair, or dwellings. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, the shells themselves bear the history of water, having been shaped by currents long before humans noticed them. Each bead thus carries dual memories, of nature and of human care, and in their use, the artisans of lake settlements wove a quiet narrative of connection, beauty, and ritual. The sounds of beads clicking softly together as they moved, the visual shimmer of pale surfaces in soft daylight, and the tactile pleasure of their smooth curves all contributed to a subtle human experience that speaks to attentiveness and patience. These perforated shells remind us that even in early settlement life, amid subsistence and seasonal movement, attention to delicate detail and aesthetic sensibility quietly persisted, echoing through the rhythm of daily existence. Drifting gently toward the eastern savannas, around 4,200 years before our time, early pastoralists in what is now Kenya were threading shells into necklaces and adornments, integrating them into daily life as both decoration and possibly markers of identity. The shells, gathered from distant rivers or traded across regions, were carefully perforated and smoothed to catch the gentle African sunlight. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, each bead carries the history of water, of currents and tides, long before human hands intervened. The act of creating and wearing these beads was meditative, a quiet assertion of human presence, aesthetics, and connection. Strung along fibers or cords, these beads may have moved softly with each step of the wearer, producing subtle sounds or reflecting flickers of sun or firelight. Beyond decoration, these shells are tactile maps of trade, environment, and attention, linking the individual to distant waters and fellow humans. Through this, we can sense that the impulse to collect, to shape, and to adorn was gentle yet persistent, weaving beauty into daily life in small, resonant ways. Around 4,000 years before our time, in Neolithic England, graves reveal bodies adorned with perforated shell bead necklaces, often arranged with care around the necks and chests of the deceased. Each bead, small and rounded, was carefully pierced, smoothed, and strung to create patterns that were visually pleasing and possibly imbued with symbolic meaning. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, to thread a string of beads requires patience and focus, a repetition that soothes the mind and produces quiet beauty. The shells themselves are witnesses to rivers, coasts, and tides far beyond the grave, bringing traces of distant waters into intimate spaces. As the beads rested against the skin, they may have tinkled faintly, caught light subtly, and provided comfort or a sense of continuity between life and death. In these Neolithic practices, we see how early humans wove together practicality, aesthetics, and remembrance, creating objects that connected them to their surroundings, their communities, and their own transient lives, all through the meditative care of tiny shells. Roughly 3,800 years before our time, in the lands of ancient Elam, what is now Iran, small perforated shells appear among personal ornaments and burial goods. These beads were meticulously selected for shape and surface quality, each drilled with care to allow stringing along fine fibers. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, each bead is a memory of water, a fragment of distant shorelines carried across land and time, transformed into a personal object imbued with meaning. The repetition of drilling, polishing, and threading required patience and attention, a slow rhythm that echoes the quiet diligence of early craftspeople. Worn as necklaces, bracelets, or sewn onto garments, these beads would have moved softly, tinkling or catching light in subtle ways, while also carrying intangible significance, perhaps social, ritual, or protective. In these small ornaments, we see the continuing human fascination with beauty, connection, and the quiet meditative satisfaction of crafting something delicate, meaningful, and portable. Around 3,600 years before our time, in the sunlit valleys of what is now Spain, the people of the Los Miaras culture were weaving small, delicately perforated shells into adornments that would drape softly over the body or embellish garments with quiet elegance. Each bead, carefully chosen for its smoothness and gentle coloration, was drilled with attentive patience, likely using fine stone tools or sharpened bone, until it could be strung along fibers made from plant or animal materials. One imagines the meditative rhythm of this work, the repeated, almost imperceptible tapping or scraping, the quiet focus of hands shaping and arranging tiny fragments of the sea. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, the shells themselves carried the memory of distant waters, their surfaces polished and etched by time, tides, and currents long before humans noticed them. To wear such a bead, to string them into a necklace or bracelet, was perhaps to hold a soft echo of faraway shores close to the heart. In the graves of Los Miaras, archaeologists have uncovered these bead strings, suggesting that adornment was not merely decorative but a gesture of remembrance, identity, or connection. These small objects, seemingly simple, quietly testify to a human desire that is enduring and gentle, to gather, to shape, and to carry beauty, even amidst the practicalities and rhythms of daily life. Drifting forward, around 3,400 years before our time, in the lands of pre-dynastic Egypt, graves yield necklaces composed of perforated shell beads, their tiny forms strung meticulously with fibers that have long since faded. The shells, sourced perhaps from coastal waters or riverbeds, were carefully smoothed and punctured, their surfaces reflecting soft sunlight or flickering torchlight. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each bead carries within it both the story of the ocean it came from and the story of the hands that touched it, shaping it, threading it, and bestowing upon it quiet significance. In the careful arrangement of these beads, one glimpses a delicate choreography of craft, patience, and aesthetic choice, an interplay between human intention and natural form. The placement of such necklaces in burial contexts suggests their role as more than ornamentation. They were symbols, perhaps of status, memory, or protection, softly marking the passage from life to the next. The act of creating and wearing shell beads in pre-dynastic Egypt embodies a kind of contemplative human continuity, an enduring whisper of care, attention, and subtle artistry that flows across generations. Moving gently eastward, Around 3,200 years before our time, in the bustling early settlements of the Indus Valley, Harappan communities were incorporating conch shell beads into personal ornaments, threading them carefully along cords and arranging them with attention to symmetry and rhythm. Each perforated shell required skill and patience, drilled to allow secure passage of fine stringing material, likely woven from plant fibers or animal sinew. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra soft reflection, the shells themselves are echoes of the sea, carrying the memory of tides, of waves caressing distant shores long before human hands found them. To hold, thread, or wear such a bead was to interact with these gentle histories, connecting wearer, maker, and material in a quiet, contemplative ritual. In the context of Harappan urban life, where settlements were meticulously planned and trade networks extended far, shell beads also carried subtle social significance, a sign of identity, affiliation, or appreciation for the delicate and beautiful. The process of making them, the repetitive drilling, smoothing, and arranging, embodies a slow, meditative rhythm, a dialogue between human patience and natural form, quietly affirming that the impulse to adorn oneself with meaning is as old as the craft itself. Around 3,000 years before our time, in the cities of Sumer, early urban life included the trade and use of small, perforated shell beads, delicately strung into necklaces, sewn onto garments, or exchanged across markets. The shells, sometimes from distant coasts, were shaped and pierced with meticulous care, each bead polished to reveal subtle textures and gentle sheen. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, to handle a shell bead is to trace both its oceanic origin and the human attention invested in it, a tactile bridge between faraway waters and intimate hands. These objects, while small, carried significance in trade, adornment, and possibly ritual, creating networks of material, beauty, and social connection. The repetitive, quiet labor of drilling and threading these beads imbued them with a resonance of care and patience, a human rhythm echoed softly across time. Worn on the body, they would have moved lightly with the wearer, producing subtle sound and glimmer, blending functionality, aesthetics, and symbolic meaning into a single, slow, living experience. The Sumerians' engagement with shell beads reflects a delicate balance between commerce, art, and intimate craft, a whisper of human sensibility that endures in these tiny, precious objects. Drifting gently eastward again, around 2,800 years before our time, the Longshan culture of ancient China produced carved shell beads, small and polished, sometimes intricately shaped, strung along fine fibers, or arranged in patterned necklaces. The act of perforating and shaping each shell required steady, patient hands, repeated attention, and an intimate familiarity with the material. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, each shell is a record of quiet natural processes, waves shaping its surface, currents polishing its edges, which then intersects with human care, creating objects that are simultaneously natural and crafted. These beads may have adorned the living, accompanied the dead, or even participated in early ceremonial practices. The repetitive rhythm of their creation, the tactile pleasure of threading smooth, cool surfaces, and the visual delight of subtle luster all contribute to a slow, immersive aesthetic experience. The Longshan shell beads thus testify to an enduring human attention to beauty, detail, and connection, a contemplative dialogue between nature and craft that carries forward through time, quietly linking distant hands, distant seas, and distant moments in human history. Finally, around 2,600 years before our time, in the flourishing city of Ur in Mesopotamia, burials reveal perforated shell bead necklaces, arranged with meticulous care and attention to symmetry. Each bead, small and gentle in color and texture, had been carefully drilled and polished, then threaded to form an ornament of quiet beauty. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra soft reflection, the shells themselves are carriers of water's memory, fragments of ancient shores, now intertwined with human narrative and ritual. The process of crafting, arranging, and placing these beads embodies a slow, meditative rhythm, a tactile and visual celebration of patience, skill, and aesthetic choice. As these necklaces rested upon the chest or neck of the deceased, they may have swayed softly with movement, reflecting flickers of light, or produced the faintest audible clicks, a whisper of presence and remembrance. In your, as elsewhere, the practice of adorning bodies with shells highlights the enduring human desire to create, to connect, and to make beauty portable, intimate, and resonant, a quiet, unhurried dialogue across time. Around 2,400 years before our time, in the verdant valleys and coastal regions of what is now Mexico, the Olmec culture began to employ small, perforated shell beads as objects of prestige and quiet distinction. These beads, carefully selected for their color, texture, and luster, were polished and perforated with attentive hands, likely using fine stone or bone tools, until each could be threaded with plant fibers or sinew. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each shell is a record of distant waters, tiny fragments of the ocean transported inland, carrying the soft memory of tides and currents that had long washed over them. The act of threading these shells, arranging them into necklaces or adornments, was not merely decorative, it was a delicate language of identity, status, and perhaps memory. One imagines the gentle rhythm of hands at work, the repeated tapping and careful threading, a meditation on craft and beauty. In Olmec society, where ritual and hierarchy intertwined, these beads were small yet profound markers of presence, each tiny object connecting wearer, maker, and material across both space and time. And so, the shells become not just decoration, but a tender bridge between people, landscape, and the enduring human desire to hold beauty close. Drifting onward, roughly 2,200 years before our time, across the highland reaches of the Andes, perforated shell beads were traded across valleys and mountain passes, carried patiently by travelers who recognized their value beyond mere ornament. These shells were often polished to a soft sheen, their perforations carefully made to allow threading, creating strings that could adorn the body or be exchanged as treasured tokens. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, the bead's journey from coastal waters to highland settlements embodies a quiet human story of connection and intention, a narrative of trade and shared appreciation for beauty. In the thin air and shifting landscapes of the Andes, each bead may have been treasured not just for its material, but for its story, a tangible echo of distant waters, journeys, and hands across time. The repetitive, attentive labor of crafting, smoothing, and threading imbued these objects with a meditative rhythm, a whisper of continuity, care, and human focus. Even in trade and transport, the beads retained their quiet beauty, a gentle, tactile reminder of the presence of the natural world and the enduring human impulse to create small objects of wonder. Around 2,000 years before our time, on the sunlit shores and hilltops of Crete, Minoan palace workshops began mass-producing shell beads, small, polished, and perforated with remarkable precision. These beads, often strung into necklaces or sewn into garments, were part of a wider culture that celebrated beauty, ceremony, and meticulous craft. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, in each perforation, one can almost hear the careful tapping of tools against shell, the soft, patient rhythm of hands at work, shaping natural materials into objects that carried both aesthetic and social meaning. The Minoans' attention to detail ensured that each bead held a quiet resonance, a tactile echo of care and artistry that survived across centuries. These shells were not merely adornments, they were markers of identity, symbols of connection between workshop and palace, craftsman and elite. To hold a Minoan shell bead is to imagine its journey from ocean, to skilled hand, to intimate placement on the body, a small object that embodies both the grand sweep of culture and the quiet, patient work of the individual. Moving east, around 1900 years before our time, in the flourishing cities of the Indus Valley, beads crafted from carnelian were often paired with perforated shell forms, creating necklaces and ornaments of subtle contrast and rich texture. Each shell bead, meticulously drilled and polished, was threaded along fibers of cotton or sinew, sometimes arranged with carnelian beads to produce harmonious visual patterns. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, each perforated shell carries the story of distant shores, the gentle touch of water shaping its form long before it met human hands. The act of threading and combining shell with carnelian suggests a contemplative aesthetic, a quiet awareness of texture, color, and rhythm in personal adornment. These ornaments were not merely decorative but were imbued with social, ritual, and possibly protective significance, marking the wearer as part of a network of cultural meaning. To engage with these beads is to feel the intersection of natural beauty and human intention, a gentle, meditative dialogue that flows across both geography and time. Around 1800 years before our time, in the storied lands of Mycenae, graves reveal shell bead necklaces accompanying the deceased, soft and gently colored, strung with care along fine threads. These perforated shells, perhaps collected from coastal waters, were arranged thoughtfully in patterns, creating halos of quiet ornamentation that adorned bodies in both life and death. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, the shells, cool to the touch, reflect the lingering memory of ocean tides, waves, and distant shores, now quietly resting upon human forms. The meticulous process of drilling, smoothing, and threading required sustained attention and patience, a meditative labor that transformed humble shells into objects of enduring significance. Each bead embodies a small story of creation, selection, and arrangement, an intimate interaction between human care and the natural world. In the context of Mycenaean ritual, these beads may have symbolized status, protection, or remembrance, a tender expression of attention and human continuity. Around 1700 years before our time, in the heart of China, the early Shang dynasty included shell beads in ritual burials, small, polished, and pierced to be threaded delicately along cords. The act of perforating each shell required patience and care, producing objects that were both functional and aesthetically gentle. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra reflective thought, each bead carries the faint memory of the waters it once inhabited, now intertwined with human ceremony and intention. As part of burial assemblages, these beads were positioned to accompany the deceased, perhaps marking status, protection, or connection to the wider world. The repetitive rhythm of drilling and threading transformed shells into carriers of quiet meditation, a human gesture of mindfulness and respect that resonates softly across time. To imagine these beads in situ is to feel the intersection of ocean, hand, and ritual, a delicate harmony of nature and human attention. Drifting gently to roughly 1600 years before our time, across the lands of Celtic Europe, small perforated shell beads began to accompany bronze jewelry, strung on threads to complement the metallic gleam of axes, pins, or bracelets. The shells were carefully selected, drilled, and polished, their subtle surfaces catching light and soft, muted glimmers. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, the shell's journey from coastlines to inland settlements mirrors the quiet human inclination to carry beauty across space and to integrate it into daily life, ceremony, or adornment. In combination with bronze, the shells created a visual and tactile dialogue between materials, a gentle interplay of natural and crafted forms. Each bead embodies care, repetition, and patience, a slow meditation on shape, texture, and arrangement. In Celtic hands, shells became not just ornamentation, but enduring expressions of identity, taste, and cultural resonance. Finally, around 1500 years before our time, in the coastal valleys and riverine communities of Peru's Norte Chico region, small, perforated shells were woven into ornaments, strung along cotton or plant fibers, and arranged with delicate attention to color, texture, and rhythm. These beads, likely gathered from nearby coasts or rivers, were smooth, drilled, and threaded with patient hands. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each shell is a quiet story of sea and land, water and human care, a reminder that even in early, distant societies, the desire to carry beauty close to the body was profound and deliberate. These small objects, modest in size yet rich in meaning, connected wearer, maker, and environment, quietly echoing across centuries as tangible whispers of human attention, patience, and aesthetic delight. Around 1400 years before our time, in the sun-baked lands of Egypt's New Kingdom, queens and elite women adorned themselves with shell bead jewelry, small, polished, and meticulously perforated. These beads, carefully strung along threads of plant fiber or sinew, caught the light softly, tracing delicate arcs across the body with each subtle movement. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each shell carried a story of distant waters, of tides and currents long vanished, now transformed into an object of intimate human beauty. The act of piercing and threading each bead required patient hands, repetitive and mindful, tapping ever so softly against the resilient surface of the shell. In the context of royal adornment, these beads were more than decoration, they whispered of status, ceremonial presence, and the quiet assertion of identity within ritual and daily life. One might imagine the subtle sound of beads brushing together, a faint rhythm accompanying processions, private moments, or reflection. These tiny objects embody both natural elegance and the thoughtful intention of the craftsman, a gentle reminder that human attention, even in distant times, could elevate small, humble materials into symbols of care, connection, and grace. Each shell bead is therefore a quiet testimony to the enduring desire to integrate beauty into the intimate spaces of life, a delicate narrative stretching across land, sea, and centuries. Drifting softly forward, roughly 1300 years before our time, in the hills and valleys of what is now Israel, Canaanite graves reveal necklaces composed of perforated shell beads. These shells, gathered from distant coastal waters and polished to a gentle sheen, were carefully drilled so that fine threads could pass through, creating strings of adornment that might have encircled the neck, wrist, or garments of the departed. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, each bead, in its small, tactile perfection, embodies patience and intention, a soft rhythm of creation where hand, tool, and material converge. In burial contexts, these ornaments were more than mere decoration, they expressed status, familial ties, or symbolic protection, conveying subtle narratives of identity and memory. One can almost hear the faint rustle of shells moving against one another, a whisper of sound that accompanies the gentle act of remembering and honoring. The bead's journey, from sea to inland settlement, mirrors a quiet human longing to carry beauty, continuity, and memory across space. These small, softly colored objects, though modest in size, connect the living and the departed, nature and human craft, in a tactile, luminous dialogue that resonates with thoughtful care, across both the body and the passage of time. Around 1200 years before our time, in the territories of Nubia, Kushite rulers integrated shell beads into their prestige goods, small objects polished to a subtle glow and pierced to allow delicate threading. These beads were not merely decorative, they were emblems of power, status, and ceremonial presence, each one carrying both aesthetic and social weight. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, the shells themselves had traveled, perhaps from nearby rivers, perhaps from distant coasts, carrying with them faint memories of water, of gentle currents and tides, now reimagined as markers of human attention and intention. Crafting these beads required repeated, attentive gestures, drilling, polishing, and threading, each step meditative, producing a rhythm of care and focus. To wear or display such beads was to embody a quiet dialogue with both nature and society, to communicate subtle messages of identity, continuity, and refinement. These small, tactile forms serve as enduring witnesses to a human inclination to transform humble natural materials into objects of aesthetic resonance, connecting body, environment, and culture in a slow, whispering arc across centuries. Roughly 1100 years before our time, in China during the early Zhou dynasty, shell beads were employed as a form of currency, small, carefully perforated objects strung together or carried individually. These shells, polished and drilled with attentive care, were valued not only for their intrinsic material but also for the labor, skill, and precision embodied in their creation. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, in the perforation of each shell is a quiet meditation, a rhythm of repeated motion, a gentle interaction between hand, tool, and natural material. To handle or exchange these beads was to engage with both the past of their formation and the human intention invested in their transformation. Their use as currency adds another layer. Each bead becomes both aesthetic and functional, a small object through which economic, social, and symbolic exchanges gently flow. In imagining these shells in the context of Zhou society, one can sense a careful negotiation of beauty, utility, and meaning, where small, tactile objects bridge the tangible and conceptual, the personal and the communal, in a quietly resonant form that endures through memory and material. Around 1,000 years before our time, across the coastal and mountainous regions of Greece, Homeric references tell us that shell beads were already part of daily life, included in personal adornments and possibly woven into stories, garments, or ritual objects. These small perforated shells, carried from nearby or distant waters, were polished and threaded with delicate care, each bead a soft reflection of human attention and aesthetic intention. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, in Homeric times, each bead may have whispered the memory of tides and ocean currents, a soft echo of the sea's presence now translated into human form. Threading these shells into necklaces, bracelets, or ceremonial items required repetition, patience, and a meditative focus, a rhythm of creation that imbued the object with both beauty and narrative significance. To wear such a shell was to carry with it a story of connection to land, water, and society, a subtle interplay of natural and cultural resonance. These Homeric shells, modest and enduring, remind us that across both geography and centuries, the human impulse to transform the simple into the meaningful, the natural into the aesthetic, persists as quietly and persistently as the turning tides themselves. Around 900 years before our time, in the rolling hills and sun-dappled landscapes of what is now Italy, the Etruscans were embracing shell beads as elements of personal adornment, threading them into necklaces, bracelets, and garments that caught the soft, shifting light. These beads, small and carefully perforated, were polished to a gentle sheen, their surfaces smooth beneath attentive fingers. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each bead carries not only the story of its distant ocean origin but also the quiet imprint of the human hand that shaped it, the repeated tapping and careful threading that transformed a fragment of shell into an intimate, wearable object. In Etruscan society, these beads were likely more than decoration, they were markers of identity, social position, or perhaps even spiritual intention, interwoven with the fabric of everyday life. One might imagine the delicate clinking of shells against one another as people moved, a subtle whisper of sound accompanying gestures, processions, and quiet domestic moments. The labor invested in producing these beads reflects a meditation on repetition and care, an awareness that beauty and attention can transform ordinary materials into objects of lasting significance. Through these shells, Etruscans created a dialogue between land and sea, craft and social meaning, the natural and the human, and in doing so, they left behind a tactile echo of their delicate, considered lives. Drifting softly forward to roughly 800 years before our time, in the tropical lowlands and highlands of Mesoamerica, the early Maya were incorporating shell beads into their royal regalia, small orbs and discs threaded into necklaces, crowns, and ceremonial garments. These shells, sourced from coastal waters and polished to glimmering smoothness, were perforated with care, their tiny holes allowing for careful threading that turned simple fragments into expressions of status, devotion, and artistry. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, each bead represents both the labor of creation and the quiet journeys of trade or pilgrimage, carried across rivers, forests, and mountains to reach the courts of Maya rulers. The act of perforating and polishing each shell was a meditation in miniature, a rhythm of repeated motion that imbued the bead with both tangible beauty and intangible meaning. Worn in regalia, the beads softly echoed the prestige and spiritual authority of their owners, producing a faint, reassuring clatter that accompanied ritual gestures or ceremonial processions. Through these small objects, the Maya communicated not only social hierarchy but also a reverent connection to the natural world, the shell's origin, its texture, and its luminous surface all serving as gentle reminders of the distant tides and waters from which they came. Each shell is a quiet bridge between nature, craft, and the human impulse to adorn, to remember, and to signify through beauty. Around 700 years before our time, in the fertile plains and sacred spaces of early India, the Vedic people were weaving shells into their ritual practices, small perforated beads threaded onto cords that adorned priests, sacred objects, and ceremonial garments. The shells, collected from rivers and coastal shores, were polished and drilled with meticulous care, their small, rounded forms reflecting both natural elegance and human intention. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each bead is a quiet testament to patience, to the repetition and focus of hands moving slowly against hard, resilient surfaces, shaping a fragment of nature into an object of meaning. In Vedic rituals, these beads were more than decorative, they were tools of symbolism, markers of spiritual presence, and perhaps even tactile instruments that produced a soft, rhythmic sound when draped, moved, or shaken during ceremony. Imagine the faint, whispering clink of shells brushing together as offerings are made, a sound that carries both the rhythm of devotion and the subtle echo of the sea. These small, simple objects reflect a deep human desire to bridge the natural and spiritual worlds, to transform humble materials into vessels of meaning and beauty, connecting hand, heart, and environment in gentle, deliberate motions that have persisted across centuries and cultures. Roughly 600 years before our time, in the lands of Greece, perforated shells began appearing in temple votive offerings, small, delicately worked beads that were strung and set aside as gestures of devotion, thanksgiving, or remembrance. Each shell, smoothed and drilled by careful hands, carries not only the echo of the ocean from which it came but also the quiet imprint of human attention, a rhythm of patient repetition. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, one can imagine the fingers of worshippers moving slowly over the tiny surfaces, threading them onto cords, arranging them into patterns, pausing to consider each bead's placement and meaning. In this context, the shells were imbued with spiritual significance, mediating between the natural world and the human desire for connection, devotion, and reflection. The small sound of beads brushing together as offerings were laid out might have echoed softly in temple chambers, a faint, unhurried accompaniment to prayer, ritual, and contemplation. These votive shells illustrate the subtle interplay of craftsmanship, natural beauty, and ritual purpose, demonstrating how even the tiniest objects can carry stories of reverence, attention, and gentle care across space and time, quietly bridging human practice and the enduring rhythms of the natural world. Around 500 years before our time, in the fragmented states of China during the Warring States period, tombs were discovered containing shell bead adornments, small, polished fragments threaded into necklaces or incorporated into burial garments. These beads, delicate yet durable, were meticulously perforated, their tiny holes allowing the threads of cord or fiber to transform raw shells into objects of beauty and personal significance. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each shell captures both the story of its origin, perhaps a distant shore or local riverbank, and the careful, meditative labor of the artisan who shaped it. In a tomb, these beads served as markers of status, identity, or remembrance, each object quietly narrating the values, aesthetics, and attentions of those who lived so long ago. The repetition inherent in drilling, polishing, and threading creates a rhythm of patience, a soft dialogue between hand, material, and intention, echoing subtly in the way the shells might have moved together. These objects reveal a human desire to translate nature into culture, impermanence into enduring beauty, reminding us that the crafting of small, tactile items has long been a way to connect with both the visible and invisible worlds, producing whispers of continuity across centuries. Drifting gently forward to roughly 400 years before our time, in the landscapes of Celtic Europe, chieftains were buried with necklaces made of small, carefully perforated shell beads, strung along plant fibers or sinews and sometimes combined with bronze ornaments. These shells, polished and shaped with attentive care, were not merely decorative, they carried meanings of status, kinship, and ritual significance. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, the creation of each bead was a meditation, a soft rhythm of tapping and drilling that transformed a fragment of nature into a delicate, wearable story. In burial contexts, the beads may have echoed the social and spiritual lives of their owners, producing a quiet clinking sound as they rested in carefully arranged patterns. Each bead embodies both natural beauty and human intention, bridging the tactile world with symbolic meaning. The shells, in their smooth surfaces and subtle luster, invite the imagination to consider the journey from river, lake, or sea to the hands of the craftsman, and then onward to the ritual or funerary context. In this gentle movement across time and space, we glimpse the enduring human inclination to adorn, to signify, and to preserve memory through the smallest, most patiently crafted objects, whispering softly across centuries and landscapes. Around 300 years before our time, in the sweeping coastal valleys and desert fringes of what is now the Andes, the Paracas culture was crafting delicate shell bead jewelry that would accompany both the living and the deceased. These small, carefully perforated shells, gathered from distant coasts and polished to a soft gleam, were threaded into necklaces, bracelets, and ceremonial adornments. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, each bead embodies a quiet narrative of patience, of repetitive labor, and of a tactile dialogue between hand and material. The Paracas artisans would have drilled tiny holes with meticulous attention, their fingers tracing the contours of shells smoothed by ancient tides, shaping objects that were both intimate and enduring. In burial contexts, these beads were not merely decorative, they held symbolic resonance, perhaps indicating social status, spiritual affiliation, or familial identity. Imagine the subtle sound of shells brushing together as necklaces shifted gently over the chest or wrists, a faint rhythm accompanying the slow ceremonies of life and remembrance. Each bead, in its smoothness and careful craftsmanship, becomes a miniature story, a whisper from the past that reaches across centuries, carrying both the natural origin of the shell and the human care invested in its transformation. The Paracas culture's shell ornaments remind us that even amid survival, agriculture, and ceremonial life, there was space for beauty, contemplation, and the quiet attention that turned simple materials into enduring, meaningful objects. Drifting softly to roughly 200 years before our time, across the islands and lowlands of Japan, the Yayai culture was incorporating shell beads into necklaces and ritual adornments, weaving nature and craft into the intimate sphere of the human body. These beads, collected from both freshwater streams and coastal shores, were polished until their surfaces glimmered softly, and each perforation was drilled with attentive care, allowing for careful threading onto cords of plant fiber or sinew. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle thought, each perforated shell carries a story of journeys, shells brought inland, carried across rivers and hills, each one touched by both the ocean and human hands. In Yayai life, these beads might have been worn daily, marking identity, or reserved for ceremonial occasions, producing a quiet, tactile rhythm as they moved and clicked together. One can imagine the patient repetition, the gentle tapping and threading, as artisans shaped fragments of nature into meaningful adornment, infusing ordinary objects with extraordinary intention. The placement of beads, their size, color, and arrangement, might have reflected both aesthetic preference and social communication, subtle signals understood within the cultural framework. Each tiny object thus becomes a gentle bridge between nature, craft, and society, echoing softly across time as a testament to the human desire to touch beauty, to hold memory, and to connect the living with both the material and the spiritual world. Floating onward to roughly 100 years before our time, in the bustling Mediterranean landscapes of early Rome, we find shells imported from the Red Sea transformed into polished beads that were carefully perforated and threaded into necklaces, bracelets, and ceremonial objects. These tiny, glimmering fragments of distant seas carried a quiet prestige, a soft echo of faraway tides brought to adorn Roman bodies and domestic spaces. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra gentle reflection, each bead represents both a journey across water and a meticulous labor of hands, the repetitive tapping and careful drilling that transforms a humble shell into a wearable story. The presence of imported shells hints at trade networks, exchange, and the subtle ways in which objects traveled alongside ideas, culture, and meaning. Imagine the faint sound of beads brushing together as they were worn during daily life, festivities, or ritual moments, a quiet whisper of connection between far-off seas and Roman hands. Each bead embodies a layering of time and space, a tangible reminder that beauty, attention, and intention are enduring qualities, carried across lands, oceans, and generations. In the simple, glimmering surfaces of these shells, the Romans held both ornamentation and story, an intimate fusion of craft, commerce, and quiet contemplation that continues to resonate in the material traces they left behind. You may not care. And that is completely fine. These shells are small, their stories long, and their excitement level blessedly low. They simply remind us that even the earliest people found calm in repetition, purpose in precision, and beauty in things that changed nothing at all. If your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.